My name is Kayla Simmons. I'm 31, and I'm a supply chain coordinator for a regional retail company based in Nashville, Tennessee, which means I've spent nearly 8 years of my career tracking inventory movement through systems that log every single transaction with a timestamp and an account name attached. Accused by my own sister of never lifting a finger to help clean out our grandmother's overstuffed garage after she moved into assisted living, I sat in my parents' kitchen 3 months ago, listening to her tell our mother a version of events that simply wasn't true, right up until the donation center called about a tax receipt discrepancy and read my name off 11 separate drop-off records. I did the entire garage myself, my sister, Renee, had told our mother over the phone, loudly enough that I could hear it from across the kitchen. Kayla never once showed up to help. If you're watching this, comment where you're from and what time it is right now for you, and hit subscribe, because this one's worth staying for. Let me take you back to where this actually started. My grandmother, Louise Simmons, lived in the same house outside Nashville for over 50 years, and her garage, over that time, became something close to a small museum of accumulated belongings, my grandfather's old woodworking tools, decades of holiday decorations, furniture from 3 different house renovations she never got around to discarding. When she moved into an assisted living facility 8 months ago at 86, following a fall that made living alone no longer safe, the garage needed to be cleared out before the house could be listed for sale. My sister Renee, 3 years older than me, immediately took charge of organizing the cleanout, setting a schedule of weekend work sessions, and assigning tasks in the family group chat with the confident authority she'd always carried in our family, largely unchallenged because nobody else tended to volunteer for the organizing role first. I participated in the actual work considerably more than Renee's public account of it suggested, though I never made a point of announcing my attendance the way she did. Renee tended to post updates in the group chat after each session. Photos of cleared shelves, captions about how exhausting the work was, subtle framing that positioned her as the primary force behind the effort. I showed up to 11 of the 14 scheduled sessions over 2 months, missing only 3 due to work travel I couldn't reschedule, and on each visit, I loaded my own car with items destined for donation and drove them to the nearest donation center myself, rather than adding them to the pile Renee was accumulating in her garage for a big drop-off day she kept postponing. I made these individual trips partly out of practical impatience. I didn't want usable furniture and clothing sitting in anyone's garage for weeks longer than necessary, and partly, if I'm honest, because I'd started noticing that anything left for Renee's group big drop-off seemed to get credited entirely to her effort regardless of whose actual physical labor had gotten it into a donatable condition in the first place. Each time I dropped items off, I requested a donation receipt for tax purposes, a habit from my own professional background in tracking transactions carefully. I never mentioned these individual trips in the family group chat, mostly because I didn't think they needed announcing, and partly because Renee's chat updates left little natural room for anyone else's contributions to register as separate from her own narrative. The specific claim that led to confrontation happened 3 months ago, once the garage cleanout was finally complete and the house ready to list. My mother called Renee to check on the final tax paperwork for the donated items, since our grandmother wanted to claim the appropriate deduction, and Renee, apparently not accounting for my separate drop-offs, told our mother loudly enough that I overheard it from the kitchen where I happened to be visiting. I did the entire garage myself, honestly. Kayla never once showed up to help. She was always too busy with work. I felt the specific sting of hearing my own effort erased in real time, in a conversation I wasn't even meant to be part of. I walked into the room and said, calmly, I'm actually right here, and I have donation receipts from 11 separate trips if you want to see them. Renee looked genuinely startled, not having realized I was within earshot. I didn't mean it like that, she said quickly. I just meant the big sessions, the ones I organized. I attended 11 of the 14 sessions you organized, I said, and I also made individual donation runs after most of them instead of leaving things to pile up in your garage. I have the receipts in my email if you want the exact dates. My mother, on speakerphone, asked to actually see them, and within a few minutes I'd forwarded 11 donation confirmation emails from the same regional donation center, each one time-stamped, each one listing my name as the donor of record for items ranging from furniture to boxes of decorations. The following week, the situation resolved itself further in a way none of us anticipated. The donation center called our grandmother's phone, since her number had been listed as a secondary contact on several of the donation forms for tax documentation purposes, asking to clarify a discrepancy in their own records regarding duplicate donor entries. My grandmother, confused, handed the phone to me when I happened to be visiting, and the donation center's tax documentation coordinator, a woman named Patrice, read off the full list of drop-offs associated with our family's account for verification purposes. "We have 11 separate drop-offs under Akayla Simmons," Patrice said, "and we want to make sure we're crediting the right taxpayer for the deduction. Can you confirm these were all made by you personally?" Renee, who happened to be present for this call as well, listening in, went quiet as Patrice read through the list in detail, dates, general item descriptions, estimated values for each drop-off. "That's basically the whole garage," Renee said quietly, almost to herself. "It's most of it," I said, not unkindly. "I never said you didn't help organize it. I just also did quite a bit of the actual physical work, and I'd rather that not get erased just because I didn't post about it." My grandmother, listening to this exchange from her recliner, spoke up in a way that settled the matter more than either of us could have. "I remember you two working together most weekends," she said. "I don't understand why it needs to be a competition now." I want to go back and describe what those 2 months of clean-out work actually looked like, because I moved through it quickly, and the texture of that time matters. My grandmother's garage hadn't just accumulated items over 50 years. It had accumulated genuine history. I found a shoebox of letters my grandfather had written her during a brief separation in the early 1970s, tucked behind a stack of paint cans, letters neither Renee nor I had ever known existed. I found my own childhood report cards, saved carefully in a manila folder my grandmother had apparently kept without ever mentioning it. Sorting through that garage wasn't just physical labor, it was an unexpected excavation of family history that both Renee and I found genuinely moving at different points throughout the process. I want to be fair to Renee here too. I don't think she set out to erase my contribution deliberately. I think she genuinely experienced the coordinating role, the scheduling, the group chat updates, the mental load of organizing 14 work sessions around everyone's availability as the harder, more significant contribution, and simply didn't fully register that the actual physical labor of hauling donations to a donation center repeatedly over 2 months was its own substantial effort that existed somewhat outside her direct view. The donation center's call wasn't dramatic in the way a courtroom reveal might be. Patrice had no idea she was settling a family dispute. She was simply doing her job, verifying donor records for tax documentation accuracy. That's actually the part of this story I find most meaningful in retrospect. The correction came from someone entirely disinterested in our family dynamics, just accurately doing routine administrative work. Renee and I talked more honestly in the weeks following that call than we had during the entire 2 months of the cleanout itself. She acknowledged, eventually, that she'd gotten so invested in being seen as the organizer that she'd stopped noticing how much of the actual work was happening outside her direct supervision. I acknowledged, in turn, that I probably should have said something sooner rather than letting 2 months of quiet frustration build up before it finally surfaced. I want to go back and talk more specifically about why I started making those individual donation runs in the first place, because I think the reasoning matters more than the outcome. About 3 weeks into the cleanout, Renee's garage, where she'd been accumulating items for her eventual big drop-off day, had become genuinely chaotic, boxes stacked precariously, furniture blocking her own car from fitting inside. A fire hazard risk that actually concerned me on a few visits given how much of it was old furniture and paper goods. I mentioned this to her once, gently, suggesting we split the load and make more frequent, smaller trips rather than waiting for one enormous drop-off. She agreed in the moment, but never actually changed her approach, continuing to accumulate items in her own garage regardless. Rather than pushing the point repeatedly, which I sensed would only create friction, I simply started loading my own car after each session and handling my portion of it independently. I think this is a pattern that shows up in a lot of families. Honestly, this quiet workaround that develops when someone stops trying to convince a sibling to change their approach and instead just handles their own piece of a shared problem separately. It's efficient in the short term, But it does create exactly the kind of documentation gap that led to this whole situation, where two different people are doing two different versions of the same overall task, and only one of them is loudly narrating theirs. I also want to mention my grandmother's reaction to all of this, because I think it's easy to let this story become entirely about the sibling dynamic between Renee and me and lose sight of the actual person whose belongings we were sorting through. My grandmother, once she heard the full story about the donation center's call, laughed for the first time in weeks. Genuinely delighted, she told me later that her garage had somehow ended up settling an argument nobody expected it to settle. She'd spent 50 years accumulating that clutter, she said, and it felt fitting, in a strange way, that it had also managed to sort out something honest between her two granddaughters before the house was even fully sold. The tax deduction itself, once properly reconciled between our two names, ended up being split appropriately between Renee and me based on our actual individual contributions, a small practical resolution that mattered less to me than simply having the record corrected, but which Renee, to her credit, insisted on handling fairly once she understood the actual breakdown of who had donated what. I think it's worth mentioning, too, how this pattern between Renee and me actually stretches back much further than this particular garage cleanout, which is part of why the confrontation, when it finally happened, carried more weight than a single disagreement about donation receipts. Growing up, Renee was always the one who organized our childhood birthday parties, our family vacations, the logistics of who was bringing what to holiday dinners, and she became, over decades, genuinely skilled at that kind of visible coordination. I tended to be the one who quietly handled whatever fell through the cracks of her planning, restocking supplies she'd forgotten, running last-minute errands, smoothing over small logistical gaps nobody else noticed needed smoothing. That dynamic worked fine for most of our lives because it rarely came with any real stakes attached to who got credit for what. The garage cleanout was different because it came with an actual dollar value attached to the outcome, in the form of the tax deduction, which meant that for the first time in our adult lives, the informal division of labor between the organizer and the one who quietly fills gaps had a concrete financial consequence tied to accurate documentation. I think that's part of why this particular disagreement escalated further than similar situations had in the past. It wasn't just about feelings this time. It was about numbers that could be verified or disputed with actual paperwork, which meant the usual pattern of me quietly letting things go stop being a viable option once actual tax records were on the line. I've thought, since all of this resolved, about how many other moments in our relationship might have looked different if a similarly objective record had existed to settle them. Most sibling dynamics don't come with the built-in accountability of a donation center's tax documentation system, which meant that for years, Renee's narrative of who did more simply prevailed by default, uncontested, because there was rarely anything as concrete as a receipt to check it against. I don't say that bitterly. I say it because I think it's genuinely useful to notice how much of family dynamics rely on whoever tells the story most confidently, absent any objective record, to check the story against, and how differently things might unfold if more of our everyday contributions left some kind of trace behind them. My grandmother's move into assisted living has settled well in the months since, and she's mentioned more than once how relieved she is that Renee and I sorted through the whole ordeal together rather than letting it fester into something that colored our relationship going forward. I think she's right to be relieved, honestly. Renee and I have started splitting coordination duties more explicitly now. On the rare occasion something similar comes up, checking in with each other directly about who's handling which piece rather than letting assumptions quietly calcify into a one-sided narrative the way they did with the garage. Here's what I actually learned, sitting in my grandmother's kitchen and watching a donation center's routine tax verification called do more to correct the record than months of quiet resentment ever could. Physical effort doesn't always look impressive if you're not also documenting it publicly as you go. People can tell a story about your absence as confidently as they like. They can't argue with 11 separate donation receipts, each one time-stamped, each one listing your name as the person who actually did the work. If this hit close to home, tell me in the comments about a time your quiet contribution got erased by someone else's louder narrative of the same effort. Subscribe if you want to see how these stories keep unfolding. Share it with someone who's ever done unglamorous work nobody thought to credit, and I'll see you in the next one.